So welcome. We are professors talking about stuff, and
Yes.
and today we're going to talk about psychological literacy. We're going to talk about where judgments of true and false come from, and kind of how that plays into why people believe misinformation and conspiracy theories. And joining me today is my friend and collaborator, Dr. Alex Swan, who is a professor of psychology at Eureka College. And he is also kind of the guy to talk about for this topic because coming out pretty soon. When is it coming out?
Hopefully within the next year. I'm still in the script writing phase.
Yes, so he is the professor of the forthcoming Wondery course on understanding cognitive biases.
Yeah.
So he is very much the person to talk to for this. So he has joined me today for this structured but fun conversation. Right,
Hopefully fun. Yeah.
Hopefully fun.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Stein, for having me on. I always love talking about this stuff. So
I think we're in good company. So we're going to talk about what it means to be biased. We're going to talk about some specific types of biases that play into why people wind up believing some weird things. We'll talk about why people perceive patterns that aren't there, and we'll also talk about knowledge biases. And if we get that done, we'll apply all that stuff to some lessons in data literacy and apply it to conspiratorial thinking and why people believe in misinformation. And I think we'll also talk at the end about CIA mind control experiments.
All right.
Should we start by talking about subliminal messages?
Yes.
Yes.
I love this topic, and this topic started my graduate career. This was doing something like this was the beginning experiment that I did on my own when I first started graduate school.
Oh, fantastic. So you probably know the major beats of this story.
Yeah.
So the hysteria kind of starts in the 50s. So this guy named James Vickery says he says they did this experiment in a movie theater where he flashed subliminally the words like buy popcorn for a fraction of a second. And he says when he did that, the sales of popcorn shot up, right?
Right.
And this kind of kicks off this hysteria for like how much of this is going on. Congress debates at some point banning subliminal advertising. It comes out later, he never did the experiment. He faked the data. He was just trying to get funding, right? What's funny is 10 years ago, me would see that as just like an incidental funny note. Modern day me sees that like, no, like this is how bullshit kind of works, right? Like someone makes something up and then the whole world winds up dealing with it, right?
Yeah, that seems plausible too, right? Like it seems like it's a plausible explanation for growth in popcorn or Coca-Cola sales.
Right, not knowing much else, the how threatening it feels you can be like, well, it feels really bad, so maybe it is true, right? And then Congress takes it seriously, so that kind of legitimizes it. And then we get into the whole thing where people start perceiving backwards messages in Led Zeppelin songs, right? And it's funny because like we started with subliminal messages and now we're at backwards messages, right? But like this quite well. So what's the problem with the idea like there's these backwards messages in the songs?
Well, it's several leaps of logic. So the idea here is that an artist puts a reversed piece of audio purposefully in their forward advancing track,
right?
And
which, by the way, is hard.
It's very hard to do, and artists have done this purposefully, but not in the way that these these people who are making conspiratorial ideas about it, because then the leap in logic here is that the brain then somehow reverses the message of the reversed audio and makes it forward, and then that is a subliminal message to behave.
Right. So there's the one accusation where it's like the message is like, hey, like shoot somebody, but it's played backwards. Somehow that still registers as shoot somebody, and then totally the person goes and does it. But then there's also the like, I just play it backwards and I hear worship Satan, right?
Right.
Which as soon as you get like a little bit of cognitive psychology, like you immediately learn like, no, like perception is guided by knowledge. So, and backward speech sounds very garbled and very ambiguous.
Right.
So if someone takes this sentence that I'm saying right now and plays it backwards, and I tell you to perceive worship Satan, a bunch of people will be able to find it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's taking that ambiguity and giving it meaning.
Right.
Right. Worship Satan. And
right.
if you can catch those syllables, then you're going to think, oh yeah, of course, that does sound like worship Satan.
Right. And this is going on for decades. And I think the biggest example doesn't come until, I believe it was 1990 or so, with the Judas Priest trial. Mm-hmm. So Judas Priest, a very important metal band. If you're not a metal fan, go ahead and check out Judas Priest. But they have an album, Stained Class, from 1978, and a couple of teenagers. It's a very tragic story. But a couple of teenagers are they're listening to the record. They're very troubled kids from a very troubled background. After they listen to the record, they shoot themselves, and one died, one survived for a while. He died, I think, right after the trial. But because the teens were listening to Judas Priest, the parents sue the band, mm-hmm. and they have to figure out what their accusation is going to be. And they settle on, in one of the songs, there is a backwards subliminal message.
Yeah. So
it's both backwards and you can't hear it.
Right.
Right. But they reason that it's the words do it. Mm-hmm. Right. And again, like kind of as you said, like multiple leaps in logic, right? So you can't even hear it. It's backwards, and it's just do it. So like do what? Mountain Dew. Right.
Exactly.
So the band winds up getting acquitted, but the judge's ruling was do you know the judge's ruling?
I actually haven't read that far into the trial itself.
Okay. Yeah. There's some videos on it on YouTube. So the judge's ruling is, it's not like this idea is ridiculous. So again, like our whole thing here is psychological literacy. Like if you understand how the brain forms judgments, you know this whole thing doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. The judge's ruling isn't like this is ridiculous. It's maybe there was a backward subliminal message in the song, and maybe it did cause these kids to hurt themselves. But if it was there, it probably wasn't there on purpose. Right?
Right.
And this is like 1990. This is not like the dark ages of psychological knowledge. If that judge had taken a course in cognitive psychology, that I don't think that would have been the verdict, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the point here, right? Like we would live in a vastly different world if there was more psychological literacy, right? Mm-hmm. So shall we dive in and talk about what it means to be biased?
Yes, please.
Let's do that. So I think the best way to talk about what it means to be biased in like a cognitive psychology kind of sense. Also, I want to add, in this particular session, we're talking from a more cognitive perspective. We're talking about the ways in which people form judgments and perceptions. Mm-hmm. There's this whole other side of why people wind up believing in conspiracies and misinformation that is more social in nature, and a lot of that kind of revolves around like people who are socially isolated and socially lonely wind up believing these kind of conspiracy theories. That's not what we're focusing on today. There's part of that is the loneliness can't be the whole picture, right? Lots of people are lonely. Only a subset of those people wind up, in QAnon. So there has to be some difference in how they view reality too, and that's what we're covering today. So I think kind of the best way of conceptualizing what it means to be biased is the distinction between system one and system two thinking. and I'll put Alex on the spot a little bit. So this was popularized by Nobel Prize winner Dan Kahneman. But do you know who actually created the term?
System 1 and System 2, I think, what was it? Paul Sloman?
It was actually Stanovich and West.
Stanovich and West. Yeah,
in 2000. So Dan Kahneman.
I've been away from the game for a while. Yeah.
So I feel like, so for those listening, if you look up Dan Kahneman, you'll see he has a Nobel Prize, super famous for popularizing this idea. He didn't create it. His book, Thinking Fast and Slow, has like tens of thousands of citations. This idea came from these other folks, Stanovich and West, in a 2000 paper. That paper has, I think, like 200 something citations.
Which is a bummer, which tells you the difference between academic publishing and popular press publishing.
Right.
Get your ideas out there.
Right. So the lesson is be famous, I think is the lesson.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, this is kind of the distinction, right? So think of all your decisions or judgments as being made up of really fast processes, and then like a slower, more deliberate process that picks up where the quicker process left off, right? So here's the fast process in action. If I say, like, what's 2 + 4, right? The answer just jumps into mind, right? Intuitively, right?
For adults.
Right. If I say what's 2 + 4, you have to think of 6. I can't tell you not to think of 6, right? And a lot of things work that way. A lot of judgments start automatically, right? If I say think of peanut butter, I can't also tell you not to think of jelly, right? As soon as I planted it, you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
And judgments kind of work that way. We have this initial fast judgment, and then later we can modify it. Some particularly complex things, fast judgment has no idea what to do with. So if I say what's 2 + 4, you automatically think of 6. If I say what's 364 times 800, 436, right? You got nothing.
Where's my calculator?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for something like that, you need to think. You don't have an automatic response, right? So how does this lead to bias? Another idea that Dan Kahneman put out, but probably didn't originate, is what he calls the mother of all biases, the what you see is all there is bias, or I just call it the Wisiati bias, WYS.
It's based on, the WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, right?
Right.
Yeah. So Wisiati is great.
Yeah, and as it sounds as a word, not bad, right? And it sounds like safe enough to accuse somebody. It doesn't sound too. It doesn't sound
like
too
Illuminati, which is kind of funny.
Yes, it does. Right. But it kind of captures in a nutshell, like, why bias happens, and like why it's kind of why it often is bad that our judgments are this combination of fast and slow processes. And the basic idea is people tend to mistake whatever little information they have for all the information there is to know, right? And it happens very quickly, which means, when that happens, you get a biased judgment, right? So, at the most basic level, right, you see, this is as with many of these, this is kind of where social stereotypes come from, right? So I see someone from another ethnicity and they're a bad driver, so I think everyone from that ethnicity is a bad driver, right?
Right.
I don't know that, right? Because I'm literally just looking at one example, but I rush to that judgment, right? I'll give you my other favorite examples, and maybe you have some of yours. So this one is from Michael Flynn. This is actually from Michael Tetlock's book on super forecasting. Michael Flynn was, I guess he's known now for being a somewhat unhinged conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, I would say that too.
Yeah, which is why he's kind of good. And this is from an example from a book that came out in 2015. Before he did that.
Yeah, so he was a respected general at that point, right?
He was, yeah. And he was in the Trump administration for like 5 minutes. But before that, he was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. And he has this quote that according to what he's seeing, according to what comes across his desk, interstate conflicts are at an all-time high, right? And he says this about 2015. In actuality, interstate conflicts were at an all-time low. He doesn't know that because he's the head of the DIA. He only gets reports on conflicts, right? So unless he stops and looks for more evidence, right? If he just goes based on what he knows, he just assumes that that's the case, right? But actually it's not. My other favorite is when people follow bands for a while and they stop following those bands, and then they get surprised when that band puts out a new album. Right?
That was me. I think we'll say last year, because I love the Killers.
Sure.
And they threw out an album last year that I was like, wait, what? They were working on an album? So yeah.
And
right, I'm the person you're talking about.
Right. Right. But the thing is, so why is this a Wizziati bias? It's like, well, of course you don't know that. You stop following them. Right. So of course you don't have access to the information. Like if you stop and think about it for a second, it's like, well, of course they're still a band. I mean, they're not going to suddenly just become accountants. Right. So like what, like why are people surprised when a band they used to follow comes out with a new album? So those are like, I think those are my two favorites that I always reference. I don't know if you have any go-to examples for that one.
Well, let me take your real examples, and let me add in my favorite fiction example. So there's a really great movie that everyone should check out, and it's called Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
I'm familiar.
Yes. And there's a very early scene that describes what is called the representativeness heuristic. It's a part of this Wizziati kind of idea. It's that, I'm making judgments based on how something is similar to things that I already know. And so there's this really great scene in the beginning of the movie where a group of townsfolk are forcing a woman to the local, I guess, police force of who later becomes Sir Bedivere, a knight of the Round Table, because this is a story about King Arthur in only Monty Python's way. And so they bring this woman to Bedivere, and they say she's a witch. And so he starts asking them questions about why she's a witch. And the very best example of this is when they say, well, she's got the nose, she's got the clothes, she's got a wart, all of that. It turns out that they put the clothes on her, the nose is fake. And they're like, well, she's a witch. She turned me into a newt, and it's this guy who's not a newt.
Right.
But the best part of it is that, this is the comedy part of it, where they turn this on their head. They turn the whole thing on their head, and you're like, well, it's going to turn out that, they're falsely accusing this woman of being a witch. She turns out to be an actual witch.
Yeah.
who just got found out in the most obnoxious kind of way.
Yeah.
And it's a good representation of like, well, we have these ideas of what witches are, and of course they are women, and so women who are doing things outside the norm. And the movie just like turns that up to 11.
Yeah.
And shows that, well, if I only have this information about witches, well, of course this woman's got to be one.
Yeah, and one of my favorite parts of that, which will be a nice segue into us talking about motivated cognition, is when the guy says she turned me into a newt, and I guess it's Bedivere. He says, but you're a human, and then he goes,
well, he just says a newt, and the townspeople all look at him, silence. Well, I got better.
Yeah, he says like I got better, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about a couple of ways in which like if you really just like grind into like whatever answer pops into your head, like that's kind of what you stick with, you can really start to dissociate yourself from reality. Let's talk about a couple of ways in which that happens. So one is what we call motivated cognition. And that's the tendency to arrive at the conclusion that you want to provided that you can come up with a reasonable justification to do so. So it's kind of like twisting around whatever information you have available to you to fit whatever preconceived notion you have, right?
Right.
So in that respect, it's like I have a little bit of information, but even if I get more, I'm still going to think the same thing, right? So like you're maybe even somewhat aware that you that you should get more information, but that doesn't really deter you. I think probably historically, how people have reacted to climate change science is kind of the quintessential example,
Right.
and it's finally getting better now in that people who have denied it for decades are finally coming around. I don't know if you saw the guy who came up with the term climate change, by the way, which is he came up with it because it sounds less threatening than global warming.
Right.
He has finally, I wouldn't say he apologized, but he said like, I effed up, basically, is what he said.
And now he leads focus groups on trying to get that messaging out to people who are still denying it. Frank Luntz, right? That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yep. So basically, studies on climate on how people react to evidence of climate change. One of my favorite ones is basically what they show is it's not just the case that informing people more about scientific method and informing people more about how climate change works makes them believe it more. Basically, if you are, this is a Dan Kahneman study. Basically, what we found was that if you're one of the people that doesn't want climate change to be real, usually it's because of like political beliefs, like you don't want government intervention. The better you are at scientific method, actually, the stronger you are in your denial of climate change, right? And the idea is the more I want it to be true that climate change isn't real, the more I contort the evidence around. And if I am someone who's actually quite good at scientific method, it makes me even more confident, right? Because I really feel like I know what I'm talking about, right? So even if I get more information, I still like kind of contort it any which way that I need to. And one of the interesting side notes on motivated cognition is most people, and I've talked to a lot of students about this, they pretty easily get to the point where they think, oh yeah, okay, motivated cognition, I can totally see how that's true of other people.
Yes.
Right. It's like you motivate contorting facts around is something you do.
Yep.
But not me, right? And if everyone thinks that math doesn't add up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Someone has to be wrong. Okay.
I mean, and that's why the literature on confirmation bias tends to, when talking about that last phenomenon that you talked about, where people see it in others but not themselves, coined my side bias, because people are focused on other things being wrong, my side being right.
Right.
And so if you applied this to motivated cognition, well, then you see that people are thinking that their thinking is unbiased. And there's actually a term for this bias, and it is called bias blind spot.
Yeah.
Because we just don't recognize that we have our own biases.
Yeah. And I think I'm the one that's not biased. I think we figured that.
I mean, I'm teaching a course on understanding biases, so of course,
I mean, I guess if there's anybody that should be able to claim that they're not biased, it would be like someone who studies what we study. But, or does that mean we really shouldn't claim it?
Yeah, we know better. We know better.
I guess so, right? And so that's motivated cognition. One other big one, as far as like defining bias, and then we'll talk about perceiving patterns that aren't actually there. And this is something that you and I have done some work on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the preference for anecdotal evidence over systematic evidence. And this is one, I feel like it is so obviously true, but humans just don't act like it is, right? So this, I think that the classic study from this is from 1977 paper by Borgita and Nisbet. Alex, I'm sure you will agree, you know you're having a good day when you're looking at one of the papers from old school with the old-timey typewriter font.
Oh yeah,
That's one of
that's
one
my
of the joys
favorite. When
of this
and
profession.
things that and you know, articles like this replicating out, you know, out in the real world here with
Yeah,
the new stuff that we're working on.
yeah, and it's this
Psychology.
is one of the ones where it's like, I guess they had to make a paper on this because you have to make a paper on everything, but it also matches with experience so well. As soon as you know that this bias is there, you'll be able to see it everywhere. So their demonstration of it was they're showing students opinions on faculty members. So basically, like, you're a student in this experiment, you're asked like to pick a professor for next semester, and they give people one or two types of information. They either show people like an overall average, so like 100 students previously rated this professor. On average, they were rated like on a 5-point scale, like a 4 out of 5 or a 2 out of 5. Or they give them just individual stories. So it's just like
testimonials.
Yeah. So it's like, here's Alex. Alex had this professor, so Dr. Alex had this professor was great.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was the individual testimonies were a lot more effective at swaying opinion than the averages, right? So it kind of manifests as like, I always kind of consider the systematic evidence as secondary to just like who I know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if the average for this professor is like 4 out of 5, like if what my one friend says they suck, I'm going to avoid that professor, right? And so this kind of falls apart. I mean, it falls apart kind of just on the face of it, right? Like, of course, the systematic evidence is more systematic, right? But also, like, if you stop and think about it, right? If I tell you there's I have a sample of 100 students and I'm giving you their average, those 100 people all have their individual stories, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm swayed by one in isolation, I should be swayed by 100 even
together.
More, right?
Yeah. Would you consider this? So I have a question for you on this one. Would you consider this then a person's tendency or proclivity to want to internalize another, like an actual person and their perspective, or some amorphous blob that is considered an average?
Yeah, I think it's the person thing, right? And I think that segues into the next. I want to talk about that's the 1977 example. I want to talk about the 2021 example, which kind of shows that exact thing. I don't know, maybe you did that on purpose, but it's a good lead in. It's a good lead in either way. Yeah. So now we're talking 45-ish years later. So this is a study from 2021, where basically what they showed was people say that facts and evidence are what persuades them, but it's actually personal experience. And so we're going to look at a figure. We're going to look at figure 1 here. Let me put that up.
All right.
So this is some research from 2021, and basically they looked at a couple of things. One of the things they looked at was YouTube videos that are attempting to persuade people of something, like trying to persuade people of like a certain opinion on gun legislation, and they looked at whether those videos whether those videos are speaking from like facts. So like studies say, like when this country when countries change their laws in this way, this is what happens, or if it's just from personal experience. So just like one story of like, hey, like I was affected by guns in this way. And a couple of interesting things. So one is what you're looking at on this chart is they use this linguistic coding software to code how emotional the language used in those different types of videos were. And what was not super surprising, but kind of good to see the data on, is the personal experience videos just have more emotion. That's what this tone score here, more towards the right, means higher emotion. not super surprising, but like, let's think about what persuades people. People tend to be persuaded by emotion. Another thing that they found that was pretty interesting was when asked beforehand, people tend to say that they'll be persuaded more by facts rather than personal anecdote. But when that actually happens, right? So the study where, like, again, someone's trying to persuade someone else of like how to feel about gun legislation, and they either give them like a set of facts or they say, this has been my personal experience. It turns out that people actually feel more rational changing their views after hearing about personal experience, because they really feel like they understand that person's justification, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I really understand your journey to that point of view, so I feel comfortable changing my views as well, right?
And I think it's a good point, if I could just interject here, a good point to say that rationality is not the same thing as logicality. So just because somebody is using information in a rational way doesn't mean they're using it in a logical way. This is a very important point that I make with my cognitive students, because things that we think are rational and that can be rational from a, you know, as objective as you can and actually be, may not necessarily be logical.
Yeah, and I think that's also a good point, right? So this is a bias, right? So if you are disregarding systematic evidence in favor of an anecdote, right? So
Right.
And the 77 example like really lays that out. It's like, most of the evidence says this professor sucks. My one friend says it's fine, right? But that said, right, like part of this is like some people have, like, marginalized groups have issues having their experiences be heard. The issue here is like, don't listen to anybody. The point here is not to say don't listen to people's experiences, right?
Right.
The issue is like, when you have a body of evidence saying one thing, one person is saying something else, like, think about it for a second, right? And I think like even in the 2021 example I just mentioned, I think it still is a bias, right? So like, it kind of makes sense to be swayed by one person's story, right? But again, like, if a bunch of other countries have already changed their gun laws and they got the results that seem like is what you want, that's a bunch of individual stories, right? So why not be persuaded by that just as much, right? And as we'll see when we kind of like apply this to conspiratorial thinking, right? A lot of it kind of comes from this, right? It's like, we know that COVID is very dangerous. Trump comes on stage, right? And he's like, well, I had it and it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
Right. Where it's like, we literally, like, it's his N of one. So that's the stats speak for a sample size of one, right?
Sample size of one, yeah.
Yeah. Versus like, we already know that it's bad, right? We know that, but because this one person is saying this opposite thing, like, a bunch of people go in that direction, right? So so you can really start to like build out not very good beliefs if you dig into favoring anecdotal evidence too much, right? So so you do have to use your judgment on this one, but being able to spot when you're succumbing to this kind of bias is pretty important.
I think it's that raises a good point about biases in general. We all have them, right? It's not like we can get away from them. They come about because of how we have evolved to acquire and use information. So it's not like we are saying that because you're making biased judgments that you are somehow inherently bad. And this is what I have to, make a point of in each of my lectures for this One Dream course, is that just because you have this tendency doesn't mean that you are a bad person or that you think bad. Or think poorly in many respects. It's just that if you now know that this is a biased judgment of taking one person's story over 100 people's individual stories average to one piece of information in a systematic way, then that is problematic.
Yeah, and I think like on the other hand, so we're not saying that biases make you bad. On the other hand, don't become a bias bully. Don't become a statistical bully.
Yeah.
We're talking about these biases like as to the extent like when they get way out of control, you can wind up in some pretty dark places.
Yeah, the fringe places, the edge cases that we all that make news.
Yeah, but like at a smaller scale, we're just kind of describing how people think.
Yeah.
Right. And with most things, we have to go with anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, we can't measure everything all the time.
Right. Like when I say like, hey, like our friend Abe is annoying. sorry, Abe, we like you, right?
I did not know he was going to say that.
Maybe he'll join me on a future episode. That doesn't like that. I'm not implying that I've done like a double-blind placebo study and like compared his rate of being annoying to everybody else's. Like I'm just cherry picking based on some information I have, right? So the bias for anecdotal evidence is everywhere. We use it all the time. Just kind of be aware of like, is there systematic evidence available? And have I wound up in some like fringe dark place as a result of, or just like, or dangerous place, or in terms of like medical misinformation, am I disregarding what seems to be systematically true for, this studio in Beverly Hills tells me that if I like rub David Bowie's face 7 times, it cures my headache, like that kind of
right.
That kind of a thing.
Goop is selling a bag of rocks for $85. They're called health rocks. Yeah. They're literally polished, multicolored rocks. A bag of multiple colors.
Yeah.
Of just smooth rocks.
Yeah.
Called a medicinal bag of rocks.
Yeah.
For $85.
Yeah, I mean it's a bargain if you think about it.
It better be damn good rocks, I'll tell you what.
Yeah. So speaking of that, let's talk about illusory pattern perception, right? So hey. So perceiving patterns that aren't there. So we're kind of shifting to the second gear. We kind of laid out what bias is. Let's talk about some more specific types of it. So let's talk about why people could perceive patterns that aren't actually there. Kind of goes back to the subliminal message, or I guess the backwards message effect. Like people see backwards messages in Led Zeppelin songs that aren't actually there. That's certainly one example. But also things like how do inaccurate social stereotypes develop, and also like if I start to think that the government is this interconnected group of pedophiles that are all working together to extract adrenochrome from children or to drink it and build a super race of robots
in the basement of a pizza parlor.
In the basement of a pizza parlor. I think I made up about half of that stuff, but I'm not.
It sounds sure. Like it sounds like Pizzagate.
Yeah. So let's talk about like how those perceptions come to be. So an older idea in psychology that I feel like just does not get as much credit as it should because it does such an amazing job of explaining so much, but I guess it requires people to think somewhat statistically, which they don't want to do. And that's the idea of illusory correlation. So that's the tendency to perceive a relationship between two variables when no such relationship exists. And it's especially likely to happen when the two variables are infrequent or attention catching, right? So like an inaccurate social stereotype, like I think one ethnicity is especially likely to commit crimes when really they're not. Actually, psychologists like nailed 50 years ago exactly why that's likely to happen. It's just like, it's interesting that you don't hear people talk about illusory correlation more. I want to talk about 2 examples.
Fancy words, that's why. The words are too fancy.
I think so. Yeah, it's bad branding. Like you guys, you should have known Chapman, that this was not a good. I had to look up who came up with the idea, and it was Chapman. Like I didn't know who Chapman was. So he comes up with this idea in 1969. So maybe Alex, can you fill in what the Rorschach test is?
So Rorschach test is what is called a projection test. So, I mean, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but have been used by clinical psychologists more in the realm of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic perspective. So think Freud, think Carl Jung, in that realm. And so the idea here is that you drop some drops on a piece of paper of ink and you fold it in half. So along that center axis, you've got a mashup of ink that then dries into a pattern. And then those patterns are then put onto cards, and clinicians then use that card or a series of cards to sort of extrapolate mental states from patients who in the psychodynamic and psychoanalytic sense, who are probably having disordered thinking in some way. And so these ink blots are just random patterns, but you've probably seen them all over the place because they're this really cool phenomenon. I mean, think of like fractal art or something like that. Like these patterns look cool, but then you're asked the question, what do you see in it? And then people say things like they look at it and they're like, I don't know, a butterfly, or
Right. And
more disturbing imagery, is the idea that if it's more disturbing imagery, then disordered thinking is higher. And so
right. And
folks that don't have disordered thinking are just going to see whatever pops into their mind first.
Right. And and we're up on methodology, right? So we know that its vagueness works against it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so loosely defined, people are just going to say whatever. And how do you know, like, does that correlate to their actual psychological condition? I mean, if they're just making stuff up randomly, no. Which is what most like studies on it generally do, right? Like basically, like, because people do it in psychologists' office, like sometimes they will reveal what their conditions are because they want to, right? But that's not the test. It's just because like that's what they're there to do. But aside from that, it's just like you're showing people random drawings, and they say random things.
Mm-hmm.
And no kidding, it led clinicians to reach some inaccurate conclusions, including the original manifestation of the illusory correlation.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what Chapman found was that clinicians tended to say that some types of responses that were infrequent, like human sex organs, were a sign of homosexuality. And this was unfortunately a time when homosexuality was still considered a pathology.
Yeah.
And he said that's what clinicians say, but then he actually looked at the data. So he looked at like how frequently do people actually say that they see human sex organs in the pictures, and how frequently actually are patients homosexual or heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
And he found there was actually no relationship between the two, right? It was pretty infrequent to say that there was human sex organs, but it was actually evenly distributed between different sexualities.
Right.
So what was going on? Like, well, like homosexuality was pretty infrequent, and it's also at the time seen as something to be on the lookout for,
Mm-hmm.
right? And seeing human sex organs is also kind of infrequent. So people incorrectly pair the two, right? The other example that came in '76, this is also, I had to go back to one of the typewriter font papers to get this one, which was fun. And this is one I feel like people should talk about this more, but like I guess it's just slightly statistical, so people just don't do it. But it's actually a really genius study. Probably one of my favorites in the history of psychology, because like it really nails social stereotyping very, very well.
Yeah.
So people are told there's two groups, Group A and Group B, and you see a bunch of sentences about them, and they all say like, this is Bob from Group A, he's friendly,
Mm-hmm.
or this is like Bill from Group B, he's mean,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's more Group A people than Group B people,
mm-hmm.
right? And proportionally, the amount of nice people and not nice people is the same, right? So for group A, there is 18 nice people and 8 not nice people.
Mm-hmm.
For group B, they just cut it in half. There's 9 nice people and 4 not nice people. Afterwards, they ask people to evaluate the groups on the whole. So like, are these cool people or not? And the finding is people really don't like group B.
Yeah.
Right. Even though proportionally, like number one, like they are nice in general, that's not how people rate them, right? And again, the idea is like, because it's a minority group, it seems a little more unfamiliar. We're kind of a little bit more vigilant towards them, I suppose you could say, and we're a little quicker to the judgment there, right? I kind of feel like more recent, like we would call this like the "I'm not racist but" bias.
Sure.
Right, because like when someone says that, they're like vaguely aware that they're judging a certain ethnicity in a kind of off way, but they can't quite put it together, right?
Yeah.
But this is kind of what's going on, and like, and when you think about how much misinformation, how many conspiracy theories wind up targeting minorities, I think it becomes pretty obvious. Like this is a reason why, like, because it is a psychological bias. When you dissociate yourself from reality and go to one of the fringe groups, like, yeah, like you're going to see this illusory correlation kind of stuff.
And groups do this on purpose. Groups do this on purpose. So one thing that is active now among, you know, white Christian nationalists, so who we would consider like the main source of white supremacy in the United States, is targeting whatever minority group advances their cause. So right now it's actually trans kids, and what sort of rights and affordances local and state jurisdictions give to trans kids.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're focused on now. But if their goals change tomorrow to focus on, you know, people with green eyes, they will pivot immediately to that group.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so that's illusory correlation. Let's talk a little bit about directly illusory pattern perception. So
this is my favorite.
Yeah, right. This is basically like looking at something that is really random, but still seeing something. So I'm going to jump to figure 3.
Figure 3.
So that's this. So we're looking at just like it's 10 pictures of quarters. Some of them are heads and some of them are tails. And so study hunters basically show they show people a picture like this, and they see a bunch of these sequences, and people are just asked, like, do you think this was created randomly or was it created by a person? And all of them are actually random. Right. But sometimes it appears to not be the case, right? So this one looks like not super random, right? Because there's only 2 tails, and they're in the same.
It certainly looks symmetrical.
It's symmetrical, yeah, in kind of a way, right?
Yeah.
There's 10 of them. The 2nd and the 9th are tails. All the rest are heads. It looks pretty orderly, right?
Yeah.
By chance, you will get a lot of patterns that look like this, that look like they are not random, right? When people think random, they think it's got to be like heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, right? That's not all patterns that you're going to get, though, right? So people that are more likely to say that this is orderly, so it's created by a person and not random, are more superstitious, right? So they're more likely to think that, like, oh, like the Rams won. Is it the Rams? I don't know.
The Rams won the Super Bowl.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. The Rams won, and like Charlie from Always Sunny, like I was wearing my special dirty shirt, right? So it must have been like 100%. That must have been it, right? So it's that, and also I think once you have those links together, like also people who do do those things are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, because again, like so much of it involves seeing ties and links that actually aren't there, right? Like so much of conspiratorial thinking involves like, oh, like everybody from the government is working together in these nefarious ways, when really what you're looking at might just be circumstantial, right? And I think a lot of conspiratorial thinking starts with the like has ties kind of thing.
Has ties, and going back to Always Sunny, the crazy board meme that has all of these interconnections and all of that stuff. Because I mean, what it boils down to in my mind is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding, and potentially, later, if you figure out what the difference is between randomness and connectedness and or orderliness, motivated cognition to not think that way. So if we look at the quarters, of course that's random because each coin flip is independent from one another.
Right.
And as you mentioned, the conspiratorial thinkers here, who are more likely to see patterns in things, create those patterns.
Yeah.
And it's this supreme desire to find those patterns.
Yeah. And like the has ties things. I think it's worth talking about that for a second, because it's
sure
that one sometimes feels so compelling. Like, so you see, like I feel like even like legitimate news outlets get roped into this, right? So it's always something like a congressperson has ties to the Saudi government, so they must be working together, right? But then you look at it and it's like some congressman's daughter works for a consulting firm that was hired by the Saudi government for a few months, right? And it's like, okay, like I can see how that's like not good, but it's also like, if I ask people like, hey, like what did your dad do at work today? Right? It's like who knows? Right? It's just like, it's so circumstantial, and it's so like it could be bad, but it's like we got to see more. If that's all you got, if has ties is all you got, then that's not great. So I'll show a couple of other examples of the illusory pattern perception, right? So again, these are random things that people kind of make more of than is actually there, right? So
this
the Madonna toast.
A good example of pareidolia.
Yeah, right. Seeing things that aren't there, right? And again, like the study is going to show that people more likely to see Madonna are also more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking.
Although when you put her face right next to it, I gotta say, yeah, it kind of looks like Madonna.
Yeah.
I like the so there's another study on pareidolia that I use because I have an episode, or sorry, a lecture on this in my series of pareidolia and anthropomorphism. And there's a famous Elvis chip out there too, that it's the profile of, unfortunately, later in life Elvis. So he's a little plumper. That's what the chip is describing there.
Yeah. There's a lot of those going around, right? So that's
famous people in food,
right?
And then this is classic pareidolia here.
Yeah, this is an angry pretzel. This one's kind of scared.
Love it so much. And the great thing is about pareidolia is because it is so automatic. Like we could even call this like sub system one thinking. It is so automatic that because we are so tuned to faces that once you see the face in these pretzels, you cannot unsee the face in these pretzels.
Yeah. So that's pattern perception. Another thing that I think is related to, I'll also call this under pattern perception, but it's the tendency to see meaningfulness in vagueness. And this is something that Alex and I have done some work on. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about it. But again, this has turned out to be pretty important for understanding belief in misinformation and conspiratorial thinking, because a lot of that involves looking at like vague evidence. I would call it bad evidence, but sometimes it's just vague,
Yeah.
and making the worst assumptions you possibly can. So let's talk about something called the Forer effect, otherwise known as the Barnum effect.
Interchangeable, really.
Yeah, named after P.T. Barnum, the circus guy. So, and this is from 1949.
Yeah.
Pretty old school, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just goes to show you, like, we've known this, a lot of this stuff we've known for what, that's like 80, 87, that's 70-ish years. So psychology students go to class, they fill out a personality questionnaire, and they get a series of statements saying, like, hey, like, these are the results of your personality assessment. And they're asked, like, how well do they describe you, right?
Yeah, he called it a personality sketch. Like, this is a sketch based on your answers.
Yes, right. So people, the trick, the twist is everybody gets the same assessment. Everybody gets the exact same set of statements, right? Yet people say it describes them individually, right? This is the set of statements.
Yeah.
Do you want to read some of them for us?
So, I mean, so if you think about these statements, consider, I would say, consider modern interpretations of this idea and what kinds of things that we are inundated with daily that sort of mimic something that was 73 years ago. You have a great need for other people to like and admire you. Like, who would say no to that?
Right. And that's the idea, right?
You have a tendency to be critical to yourself.
Yeah.
Of course. And yeah, you bring up a good point. They're supposed to be pretty agreeable, right? Here's the fun thing about this, everyone. Bertram Forer bought an astrology book from a corner newsstand, and that's where he pulled these from.
Yes, right. Yes, these are all taken from astrology predictions. Yeah. And
so
the
1949, I don't know, your Capricorn, Taurus, Aquarius, whatever they were saying, 1949, he just grabbed some good ones and plopped them down. It's brilliant. Yeah.
And again, the idea is, like, they're all so vague that, I mean, actually, like, so it is kind of true, like, these statements do describe, right? Like, I guess this is kind of like the classic vague statement about a person, right? Sometimes you're extroverted and sometimes you're introverted.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So what am I?
So they are kind of true, but the thing is, people think, like, it's tailored just for them.
Yeah.
Right. Which is literally not, because everyone got the same thing. Right. But people kind of see it, see as if it's tailored for them. The more modern twist on it is the bullshit receptivity scale. So we'll spend a minute talking about that. So basically, the idea, I'll show the scale in a second, but people see this series of very, very abstract sentences that are literally put together at random. And they're kind of based on vague motivational quotes. And the guy, Gordon Pennycook, that put this together, I think, like, he found a website that generated these kind of quotes randomly. And he asked people to rate.
Amazing by itself.
Yeah. He asked people to rate, like, how profound those statements sound. And later it turns out that seeing profundity in these statements is related to, for example, ability to tell fake news from real news, right?
Yeah.
The people that see more profundity believe fake news more, right? And again, the idea is, the more you're seeing profundity and, like, vagueness, the more you're able to kind of see the truth, so to speak, in everything, even when it's not there, right? You're seeing ties that aren't there, right? So this is the bullshit receptivity scale. And what's funny is, like, every time you read one of them, I feel like I have that little struggle to actually make some meaning out of it, right? But remember, they are all put together randomly, and they really don't have meaning, right? So like wholeness, quiet, infinite phenomena, right? Good health imparts reality to subtle creativity, right? You could see it on a motivational poster, but they don't actually make sense.
With a cat like holding a pencil or something, you know.
Right, right. And there's this idea from linguistics called the guru effect, which is when a high status person makes a statement like this, we really probe it for meaning. And we really can't bring ourselves to think that it's just a bunch of meaningless nonsense. So here's a couple quotes from a paper on the guru effect. These are actual quotes from big time philosophers. So
Real
this
people,
is from Jean, this is from Jean-Paul Sartre. So consciousness is a being, the nature of which is to be conscious of the nothingness of its being.
Cool.
This is from Martin Heidegger. I'm not a philosopher, so I actually don't know him, but if you're into philosophy, he's a big name. Beauty is a fateful gift of the essence of truth, and here truth means the disclosure of what keeps itself concealed. Right? Totally meaningless. So apologies to any philosophy majors listening out there. This is gonna get this one gets us in trouble. But it's just like it's just a bunch of stuff, right? It just doesn't mean anything, but because it comes from these high status people, we ascribe a lot of importance to it, right? Should we briefly describe Stein and Swan 2019?
Sure, I can. I'll see if I can get this down in like a minute. Okay, so there's a personality assessment out there that you might be familiar with. It's the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and it essentially is following this idea that we all have types of personality, and that people can be put into types of personality. And the kinds of questions that are asked in this are along the lines of these bullshit receptivity scale items. And so Dr. Stein and I were like, okay, well, what if we compare those really abstract statements with another kind of personality assessment out there and theory that is the Big Five, or the 5-factor model, which is a trait-based theory. So distilling personality down to traits as opposed to types. And there is hundreds of thousands of, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but there's like 10,000 some items that have been collected for the Big Five, right? Is that
it was, I think it was in the hundreds, but there's a lot.
Maybe I'm over exaggerating there, but there are a lot of items that are useful for testing people's Big Five traits. And these are the ocean traits, like openness, agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion, and conscientiousness.
Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Yeah, ocean. There we go. I don't know why I decided to say ocean and then go in another order.
It's spelled OCEAN. Let's start with E.
Right. So
there's no logical beginning point there.
No, I mean, it's also canoe, right? So we took items from both tests, although we technically couldn't use items from the actual Myers-Briggs. So we grabbed the items from a sort of copycat test called the Kiersey temperament sorter. And so what we did was we showed those items. So we weren't interested in people's personality per se. We weren't like giving them these assessments and being like, hey, what's your personality, and compare the two. No, we literally gave them these like a handful of items. I think it was like 5 each or something like that. And we asked them to rate how confusing they were, and so to speak. And it turns out that the difficulty of deciphering the items really does play a role in how profound people think those items are. And in this case, the Myers-Briggs kind of typology tests with their confusing items leads to more profoundness. And so what is that going to lead to? That's going to lead to people thinking that the results they get from these assessments are far more important to their personality, to their understanding of themselves, than something that is basic, like what you would get from a trait assessment.
Yeah, yeah. So the idea was like most people are not trained methodologists.
Yes.
Right. So actually, it's better to write more specific questions than more vague questions.
From a methodology standpoint, for sure.
Right. But it winds up being like the way people look at it is kind of twisted, because people actually like the vague questions because they feel like more of themselves are being revealed in it. Right.
Yep.
So it's kind of like an unfortunate spiral, right? Like the worse the test is, the better people think it is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which leads into very nicely into, I think, the one knowledge bias that we'll talk about before applying this to data literacy and conspiratorial thinking. So we should probably talk about the illusion of explanatory depth, right? The idea that you know way less than you think you do, right? And I think our study was kind of a good example of that. Like people like think that this test is measuring their personality, but actually it's just a bad assessment.
Right.
So my favorite example of this, I'll give my two favorite studies. One is the study goes something like this. So people are asked, like, hey, do you know how a zipper works? And people say, yes, I do. Right. And then they're asked, okay, how does a zipper work?
Tell me.
And then they go, well, crap, I don't know. Right? and you know, and they did like zipper. They did what were the other ones they used? It was like how's a bicycle work? It was a few things like
bicycle
that, right?
is my favorite. Is the one that I always use. Yeah.
Yeah. So people like they say they know how it works, but they've never actually thought about it before. Right. So they assume they do it, but once confronted with the actual question, they don't know. Right. My other favorite example is, I think it's from that same paper. People are asked, it's from 2002. People are asked if they're for or against the Iraq War. They're asked how strongly they feel about that. And they're also asked to identify where Iraq is on a map. Right. And the more off they were on identifying Iraq, the stronger they were in their views. Right. And that's because people that actually knew what was going on kind of tend to see the pros and the cons, right? Like, so we know like history does not look well on the decision to go to war.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But like in 2002, like there was a conversation, like what are the pros and cons, right? When people who knew what was going on knew about that, so they're going to have more moderate opinions, and they're also going to know where Iraq is on the globe. People who have no idea what's going on are just going to be like, yeah, war, or yeah, no war. Right. But because like they don't actually introspect into what they know, they don't have any reasons to doubt themselves.
And I think this has parallels with what's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine. So we have midterm elections coming up this year in this country, and it's entirely possible that the vast majority of Americans are going to base their decisions not on where Ukraine and Russia are and what kind of conflict is occurring in eastern Ukraine right now, but more along the lines of what that's going to do to them. So we already know gas prices are going to go up. And we already know that most people blame the president for gas prices, which is completely false. But still, people with not strong views on what's happening in Ukraine. Okay, let Eastern Europeans handle their own business. I don't know much about Russia or Putin or anything, or whatever is going on there. I just know that I have to pay more per gallon.
Yeah,
and I don't like that.
I mean, and I also know from my studies, right? Like just asking people, like I've done studies where like I rate how much people believe in COVID misinformation. Like, do you think like holding your breath kills COVID, things like that? And then just ask people like, how often do you follow the news? Those two things are related. The more people say they follow the news, the less likely they are to believe in the misinformation, right? Which I mean, like there it is, right? That's pretty striking. People like they'll tell us. I think one of the lessons is like if you listen to what people say, you'll know what to think.
Right.
And that's kind of where it is, right? So let's talk about data literacy for a few minutes.
Mhm.
And then maybe we'll talk about CIA mind control experiments
All
to
right.
end. So let's put all this stuff to work, right? So I think like remember, like the big picture here is like be careful of the first thing that pops into your mind, right?
Mhm.
Also, like be careful of things that are vague. Be careful of like perception of patterns that might not actually be there. Um, so let's put this to work a little bit and talk a little bit about data literacy. And I think we'll also look at a couple Q drops.
Q drops. All right.
Yeah. So here's a quote from this is from the Office of National Drug Policy, and they didn't like the marijuana.
They
Right?
never have liked the marijuana.
Yeah. So they
I could
say
go off on a tangent on the history of cannabis control in the United States. It's wild.
right. Um, so they say, did you know that young people who use marijuana weekly have double the risk of depression later in life, and that teens aged 12 to 17 who smoke marijuana weekly are 3 times more likely than non-users to have suicidal thoughts. And if that's not bad enough, marijuana use has been linked to increased risk for schizophrenia in later years, right? Um, so the implication, not really said, but I mean, there's no other way to read this, is that marijuana is causing the depression and the schizophrenia and the suicidal thoughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, of course, the problem is like, why do people use marijuana, right? Especially when it was somewhat harder to get, right?
Yeah, you're right.
Um,
Yeah.
but you're using it in part because you're trying to feel better,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, just looking at the drug action, it doesn't do any of these things.
Right.
So it actually has the exact opposite effect. The high of marijuana use is euphoria.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So there is a pattern, right? There is a real pattern, like between like depression and marijuana use, but there's not a causal pattern,
Right. This
right?
is so correlations bidirectional.
Right. Right. So don't it might seem intuitive that like it's coming from an authoritative source,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's not real. Let's look at one other graph, and then let's look at some Q drops. So this is from an actual congressional hearing. There was a congressperson that was trying to build some more nuclear power plants, and they put up this chart, and they show like, hey, look, the more energy a country consumes, the higher the life expectancy, right? And the chart actually does show that trend, right? So this is every data point here is a country, and you see this very clear positive trend. And they're saying like, okay, like we should build more power plants,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of course, the issue here is energy consumption is just a proxy for like having more money, right?
Yeah.
As a
Being more
country,
developed. Yeah.
right? And you could put anything on the x-axis. So here's the same graph, except we swap out internet users per 100 people, and you see about the same thing, right? So any marker of wealth is going to work out here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, like there is a pattern, but it's not the pattern that the communicator is saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, like put everything we're talking about together, right? Like the tendency to just like accept what you're given and not consider the systematic evidence, right? It might seem compelling initially that yeah, like more nuclear power plants is gonna extend life, but like that's actually not supported by this data. That doesn't mean nuclear power is bad, by the way. It's just like that this is a bad argument.
Yeah, and it's the x-axis here says kilogram oil use, right? So per kilogram of oil, and being used as an argument for, hey, let's get a different kind of energy
Yeah,
source.
yeah,
Even
yeah,
though we're using fossil fuels, let's get a different kind of energy source and extend life. Like
yeah,
it's bad.
yeah. Let's look at some Q drops. right? So do you know what I mean by by Q drops?
I think these are the things that the anonymous and infamous Q like puts on the internet, and and then the Q anonymous supporters are like, right?
Yeah. So Q is this person that posts on 4chan.
4chan, that's right.
Yeah. We might know who it is, might not. But regardless, the reason why the QAnon conspiracy theory happened is because this person started posting these very vague things that, again, consistent with everything we're talking about today, people just started to find meaning in. So let's take a look at a couple of these. So this is one of them. So this is, let me zoom in here a little bit. So this is the actual Q drop on the left, right? And it's just all like very vague stuff, right? It's just stuff like duty, period. Find the link, common denominator, period. Error made, period, right? And what people will do is they'll like find one of these vague sentences in like something somewhere that someone in authority has posted, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they start like, oh, like John O'Brien was one of the big wigs at the time. Someone posts a comment on what he's saying. They use the phrase malleable people, right? The Q drop says weak minds. So this must be some kind of a secret message. These are hard to decipher in general. Like it's even like kind of hard to trace the logic that they're going through, but that's like, that's kind of what it is.
And that's what the different, I mean, the different colors in that image, not the one you're showing now, but the previous one, different colors are sort of trying to kind of group things together to sort of get an idea of what one random person is sort of making up.
Yeah, right. And here's another one. So this is a tweet from James Comey, former head of the FBI. You might remember him from the 2016 election. And he posted this thing about 5 jobs I've had. And then a Q person circled the letters J, I, and H, A, D. So they see it as 5 jihads, and they take it as a sign that some kind of war is about to happen. Right? So again, just like total illusory pattern perception. So it's interesting, like how many QAnon people are actually looking at the Q drops. Probably not many, but like keep in mind illusory of explanatory depth. Like they probably assume that someone somewhere knows what they're doing, even if they themselves are not looking at the Q drops, right? One more I think is kind of interesting. I'll just highlight this. So they see that, so they think that Google is involved in the pedophile conspiracy. And
Chrome.
they see, right. So part of it is like is that the government is extracting adrenochrome from children, and Google has a browser called Chrome. So they see that
just makes complete sense, right?
As an admission, right? So like we've been talking about this for a while, so we can kind of see the illusion pattern, but there is like this sci-fi fan in me that kind of wants to see it, right? And that almost kind of makes sense.
The fringe dystopian sci-fi,
yeah,
where there is this global cabal that's gonna get found out, even though that's not a thing.
Yeah. So that's kind of like psychological literacy. I want to talk about like one potential solution and talk about CIA mind control experiments. And I'll post the video on what's called Bayesian Thinking. There's a video from Julia Galef who does a really great job explaining it. So I'll just give a brief explanation. If you're watching this, pause this video, go watch Julia Galef, and then come back. But the basic idea is, rather than just seeing like, if I see a claim like, hey, like there's if I see a news report on like, here's the latest evidence of whether COVID was created by a lab leak, I don't just decide like, is it true or is it false? I think before I was reading this article, what would I think is the percentage? What do I think are the chances that that COVID was created via a lab leak? And then rather than just thinking, is it true or is it false? After I read the article, I just try to adjust my percentage, right?
Mhm.
And it's a way of like making a lot more moderate judgments, right? So I go into the article thinking like, I think like there's a 30% chance that COVID was created via a lab leak. I read the article, the evidence seems like okay, so I'm going to up it to like 35, right? So it's this idea of like making small adjustments, right?
Yeah, and the idea here is that those small adjustments at time 1, at time 2, at time 3, at time n will gradually shape your behavior and your judgments to more moderate. So it's, you can't just do it once and hope for the best. You have to do this constantly. It's tiring, it's effortful, but you have to do that if you want to counteract these initial visceral emotional responses that you have to things.
Yeah. So CIA mind control experiments. This is the closest I know. This is the closest example I know to like what we would call like modern day conspiracy theories, that type of thing being true. Actually happening. It's still very different, but it's the closest I know. So
well, then there was also the men who stare at goats.
Yeah, kind of related thing, right? So post World War II, the U.S. government, number one, hires a bunch of ex-Nazi scientists,
which is not great, problematic in and of itself.
Right. They do an experiment. They're trying to develop bio. This is all hysteria because they're afraid of what the Russians are doing.
Right.
So we're afraid the Russians are developing bioweapons, so we have to too. So they start to develop a bioweapon, and they want to do a test on their ability to spread it. So they basically like dilute it to a non-lethal dosage, so they think, and they drop it over San Francisco. And it's colored, so it's like they can trace it. So 11 people check into the hospital. One dies, but he has a pre-existing condition, so it's not clear if that actually killed him. But like that's pretty nasty.
Yeah, that's egregious.
And also the CIA. So they're afraid the Russians have mind control ability, and they think that's how the communists are recruiting people. So this thing called MK Ultra starts, where they experiment mostly with LSD for a number of years, and trying to develop what they call a truth serum, which is so like you can torture people into saying whatever you want, right? But you can't control their minds, and you can't like control their actions, right?
Yeah.
They were trying to drug people into being basically robots. This is where the term brainwashing even comes from.
Right.
They thought that's what the Soviets were doing. So they start doing these secret experiments, mostly on prisoners and college students that they trick into doing this. And they also do parties where they secretly dose people with LSD. They try pairing it with prostitutes. So they put the guy on LSD, but they also hire a prostitute to flirt with them and to see if that like ups the ante. And they bring them to the secret CIA house, and of course they build a room where they can watch all this happen because of course they do. It wouldn't be a conspiracy theory, right? So they do this for a number of years, and it's all like terrible and awful. It's like experimenting on prisoners, and it's just atrocious. They conclude it's not possible to brainwash. Right? After all this,
shit.
At least they're honest, right? So given that happened, so why am I still comfortable like when someone says like, oh, like the vaccine is actually like it's a tracking device, it's a Bill Gates thing, or like it's dangerous and like it's actually hurting, it's making people sterile. Why am I still comfortable saying like no, like obviously it's not happening? So a couple things. Number one, like scientists and government is made up of a lot of different people with a lot of different agendas, right?
Yeah.
The reason we know any of this is because someone in Congress was like, let's get all this out there, right?
Yeah, they were appalled.
Yeah. And number two, you always have to look at who's saying what,
Yeah.
right? And that the folks in the CIA did this, so very few people actually knew what was going on, but they were doing it because of paranoia, right? They were doing it.
And I want to add here, because the paranoia about what the Russians were doing, the Russians were going to try to create super soldiers, quote unquote, super soldiers. They wanted to do it via classical conditioning.
Yeah, which didn't, but I guess we can save that for.
I mean, if you know anything about classical conditioning, first of all, it's not going to last. And second of all, it's only for things that we do reflexively. So if you're saying go into battle and kill that other guy, like, no, that's going to be something that I have to think about that I can't be robotically doing. So they were going down the way wrong path. I mean, MK Ultra, super terrible, but at least it was dealing with some psychedelic, psychoactive substance. Classical conditioning is not going to get you anywhere close to that. So paranoia was half baked.
Right. So it's coming from a very paranoid place, and with our theme, it's coming from a deep place of a total lack of psychological literacy. Right. They were doing all this stuff because they did not actually understand how people's mind works. Right. Like similarly, like QAnon and vaccine conspiracies, like they come from a place of paranoia, and they come from a place of a lot of the biases that we're talking about. So my prior belief that any of them is going to be true, even taking into account that, like, yes, the government has done some pretty nasty things in the past, and again, like, this is the closest I know that's like somewhat similar in spirit to like a vaccine conspiracy. I think it's still quite different. But the prior probability of it being true is still just so low, and the evidence is so bad that I'm still very comfortable saying, like, no, like, vaccines are fine, like, because that's where all the evidence is pointing, right?
Yeah.
So that's it. That's our journey through psychological literacy. Any parting thoughts?
I hope everyone who is watching likes my 60s inspired fake wall paneling behind me.
I thought it was real.
Yeah. In any case, cognitive biases and their counterparts of social cognitive biases are really fascinating, and it really gives you a glimpse of how people think and behave the way that they do. Because one of the fun things about teaching psychology, and I know this is a interdisciplinary class, I think, so not everyone is, a psychology major or anything like that. And the idea is that a lot of psychology majors do have, or a lot of people who are interested in psychology, is why do people do the things that they do? And I think this breakdown gives you a good idea of some of the lay or folk psychology that people have. And we're just giving explanations to what you already see. And it's just, I think it's really fun. Hopefully my enthusiasm is infectious, just like COVID.
I think so. I think it will be. Okay. Excellent. So we will end it there. We'll see you on the next one.